For those who have careers that keep them out at sea for long periods of time, what is the creepiest thing you've seen out in the water? Not so much creepy as eerie, but being out in the blue at night in a lightning storm and a slack wind. The ocean was very flat, no big rolling swells, just tiny little ripples. The whole world would be black, and then there would be a flurry of bolts, and the whole world would be silver. The ocean looked like nothing so much as aluminium foil that had been scrunched up and flattened out. The water looked like mercury, and all the little ripples made these very dramatic black shadows. This sort of qualifies. Former Navy here. Somewhere off the coast of Italy, saw a very, very small boat, not much bigger than a rowboat, about 9 or 10 miles offshore. This was sometime around midnight. There was no light from land, and no other ships around. It had a light. Our ship captain said it was a fisherman, and the fish would be attracted to the light at that time. Imagine being in a rowboat about 10 miles offshore in the middle of a pitch-black night, waiting to see what finds you. I used to be an oil field diver in the Gulf of Mexico. I'd say about 80% of the dives I logged were at night, mostly 500 FT and under DSVs. It's very eerie feeling sitting on the downline doing in-water decompression in the middle of night. I'd always ask topside to turn off my headlight, like a worm on a hook, just bobbing in the darkness. Some 20 years ago. On the MV Explorer, since sunk, down near the Antarctic Circle, sailing around the bergs and occasionally making landfall. We rounded into a small bay area, and there, amongst the ice and coast, was an unmarked sailing yacht, which is odd as generally yachts have some identifying markings on them. To add to it, they didn't respond to any radio contact, and whilst I wasn't privy to the conversation, and it was a long time ago, some crew went across via Zodiac and were refused boarding. So basically a yacht, not a particularly large one that was unmarked, was hanging around in the inhospitable waters of the Antarctic and didn't want any help or contact. Proper weird. I was on a 30-second speedboat and got caught by nightfall in between islands. No nightlights on the boat, navigating using GPS and depth finder. Captain knew the way like the back of his hand since he'd sailed those waters since he was a kid, but for me it was my first time in the middle of the ocean at night. Pitch black, but for the stars. As above, so below. It seemed as if the boat was floating in the blackest void of the universe. Years later, I saw the movie Life of Pi and the scene where Pi is in his lifeboat, floating in the dark among the stars, no above, no below. It was exactly like that. I still have dreams about that night. The engulfing dark and the silence that was not silent. Surreal. We made it safely to port. Captain fitted the nightlights on that boat the day after. I worked on the sailboat one summer in the Bahamas, and something that you see a lot when you're in the ocean is kayaks and life jackets floating around, and you always radio them in, but they always just fell off a yacht or something, and it's never a big deal. Once we found a kayak floating, and it had a fishing rod in the rod holder, which basically meant someone was using it. In 20 years, the weirdest shit I've seen is other people that work out here. There's about 40% of the sailors like what they do and are good at it. Another 40% that are good at it, but would do something better if the money was right. But there's another 20%. If they lived ashore for more than 6 months a year, they'd end up dead or incarcerated. There's no more west for them to go to, so they went offshore and became our problem. I have a friend who works on ships. He said the single scariest thing he had ever seen was looking out a window and seeing a wave that he said looked like it was 100 meters high pass right by their boat and suddenly disappear. He knew about rogue waves, but he said seeing one that big and that close and watching it suddenly just vanish was so creepy and shocking that he was literally stunned for a minute. I was drinking in an airport bar and met a woman who worked as a commercial fisherman on her way to SE Asia for R&R with her family. Real salt-of-the-earth lady. She regaled me with stories about her work, all the good stuff about working in her world, all the reasons she kept doing it for decades. I asked her what the scariest thing she saw out on the open ocean was, and without any hesitation she said, "Oh, an underwater UFO. I saw one rise up out of the ocean next to my boat and fly off into the sky." The matter-of-factness of her answer bothers me to this day. I was underway from the port of Houston to Cartagena, Colombia. The vessel cuts all lights off on the outside of the boat, so it's pretty dark outside. I would always go and sit out on the deck and listen to my headphones and look at the stars. Well, one night, somewhere in the middle of the Caribbean Sea, I noticed a swarm of lightning bugs cross the boat. Totally blew my mind to see light out or nowhere. At least I think it was lightning bugs. On the same trip heading back to Houston from Colombia, I witnessed a satellite crashing. At least that's what I think it was. It steadily strobed and lit up the night sky and water for about 15 minutes, till I couldn't see it anymore. And on a different trip, I was in the middle of the Gulf of Mexico. No moon, no clouds, no light pollution. The amount of stars that I saw made me cry. Never thought starlight alone could cast a shadow. Definitely mesmerizing. I still remember it like it was yesterday. I was in the USN back in the late 80s, early 90s. Cruising through the Indian Ocean in a 100% blackness, then waking up the next afternoon and looking over the rails and seeing hundreds of sharks swimming alongside of us constantly. Every now and then we would get a man overboard alert. They never recovered even one of them at night. They were usually suicides. Sometimes, during nighttime, I have went out of the accommodation, leaving compartment on board merchant ships, to breathe some fresh air or to take out the trash since the garbage station was outside. And when it is completely dark and the water is calm, you hear the splashing water against the ship's hull. Well, I can't explain why, but the ocean water was luring me. But at the same time, you are terrified, since nobody will find you if you fall overboard. So sometimes I was just staring at the water in the dark, and inside me was some struggle, like some part of me wanted to jump in, while the other was terrified that it would be a one-way ticket. Can't still find the explanation for this. This hypnotic, mesmerizing feeling I get, and at the same time the chills running down my spine, that if I would fall in the water, it's game over for sure. I heard the call of the void one time when we went swimming without life vests off of the coastal trench. The water below you is around 200 feet or so. Before I knew it, I wanted to touch bottom. Like a compulsion gripped me, and I was swimming down, 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 and it got colder and darker as I went. I snapped out of it with just enough time to make it back to the surface before I needed to breathe. I was like, what is this? Why am I swimming down so far? I am a mammal with lungs, for crying out loud, get me out of here. Frightening to think if I hadn't had that moment of clarity, how deep I would have gone, and if I'd have even been able to get back.